Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very pleased and honored to have on the podcast Andrew Knoll. Andrew is the Fisher Professor of Natural History at Harvard University. He has his BA in Geology and his PhD in Geology as well. He has been teaching at Harvard as an associate professor in biology since 1982, where he has been a member of the faculty. He has served as both professor of biology and professor of earth and planetary sciences. Much of his work focuses on the early evolution of life, Earth's environmental history, and he has also served on the science team for NASA's MER mission to Mars. He has numerous honors, including the Walcott Medal and Mary Clark Thompson Medal of the National Academy of Sciences. He is also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society and American Academy of Microbiology. We start the conversation by talking about how light, gravity, dark energy, and dark matter tell us about the early origins of the universe and of Earth. We talk about the various layers of the Earth. We talk about the importance of zircons for telling Earth's time. We talk about tectonic plates and give somewhat of a comparison with other planets such as Mars. We talk about how we define life and what it means for us and how we look for life elsewhere in the universe. We talk about where we know life began on the Earth. We talk about the history and importance of the geological timescale. We talk about fossils from various periods, the significance of the Cambrian period, the importance of soil for the environment, and the impact of the changing climate through history and the current human influence of climate change. As I mentioned in the conversation, I've had a few people on the podcast already that have talked about the history of the Earth from various perspectives. Namely, I've talked to Patrick Roberts, kind of about the history of the Earth from about tropical forest and that vantage point. I've talked with Henry G., kind of a wide-ranging generalist approach of the history of the Earth. And so in this conversation, I really wanted to focus on what the rocks tell us, right? Obviously, Andrew is well established within geology and has been studying this his entire life. And so I wanted to know the history of the Earth from a geological perspective. And I can say that this conversation definitely accomplishes that. I had such a wonderful time talking with Andrew. He's such a wonderful man, brilliant, and was really, really generous with his energy and his time. And I was super excited to talk to him. And so now I bring you Andrew Knoll. I'm here with Andrew Knoll. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very, very excited to talk to you, and it's a big honor, so I appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So you have written a wonderful book called A Brief History of Earth, 4 billion years in 8 chapters. This isn't your first kind of popular science book, is it? I can't recall.
Well, I wrote a book about 20 years ago, which was, I would say, semi-popular. It would be good for, advanced undergraduates or something. But this one, I think, was the first time when I was writing for my neighbor, the person at the gas station, everybody.
Well, it's well written because I'm not a geologist, I'm not a biologist, and so it's very well received, at least on my end, and I think I've talked to a few people that have read it, and they've said also very positive things about it. So it's very digestible for folks. So it's fantastic. So right before we get into the contents of the book, why don't you tell folks just a little bit about who you are, what you do, what your background's in, and why you decided to write the book?
Okay, well, I guess the place to start is that when I was an undergraduate in college, like many an 18-year-old, I had no idea what I wanted to do in life, and ended up taking a course in biology and a course in earth sciences the same semester. And not only did I love both of them, but in probably the only real insight I ever had in life, I realized that in some ways they could be thought of as two sides of the same coin. So I've spent really the last 45 years or so really trying, in some ways, as a paleontologist, to understand the history of life as a narrative history, But then as a geologist and geochemist, trying to understand the physical history of Earth and its environments, and in particular, trying to understand how those two, in a sense, talk to each other through time. The reason I wrote the book was really twofold. One, I think the story of our planet's history is ripping yarn, as they would say in Victorian England. I think that your life is enriched if, when you look at the hills and valleys and all the life around you, that you look at it with some understanding. And then also, I must say that, there is a concern about the rapid change in our planet in the 21st century. And I thought that maybe if people understood how everything around us came to be, that it might help them to understand what's at stake as the Earth changes rapidly right now.
Yeah, I think that that's super, super important. I think that that's it's not explicitly stated, I guess, in the book, like throughout, each chapter or anything, but it is a kind of undercurrent. Like, here's why this is important. Knowing our history of the planet can be really helpful in understanding, where our future could be going, and many things that we can do now to kind of help that. So, in talking about, I guess, the history of the planet, and then kind of keeping an eye on the future, I had a couple of months ago, Henry G., who's over there at Nature.
Right now, Henry.
Yeah, and Henry's great. We get on very well together. And he also wrote a book about the history of the Earth. Right, it's a very short history of the Earth for the layman. And I was thinking about it, and I saw your book had either come out either before or shortly after. And I said, well, why would I have two different, scientists and, experts in their field talk about the history of the Earth? And I remember reading your book and saying, well, this is super different. And it's really, really, really good because of the emphasis, right? And I haven't had anyone that's done like earth sciences or geology proper on here. And so I figured much of the conversation about the history of the Earth, we can just focus on your expertise and talk a lot about the geology, because much of what we understand from the history of the Earth and time is in the rocks and in many different parts of the Earth's land and seas. And so I think it'll be a really cool angle to talk about many of the things in your book. So you start kind of all the way at the beginning. So maybe the first, chapter or two, I guess, is kind of some of the physics or astrophysics part of it. But one of the things you mentioned early on is this idea of how light and gravity are essential for understanding the origins of the universe. So you don't have to give the full download, but just kind of explain how when we understand the functions or the beginnings of the universe, how these two pieces are pretty pivotal.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that when you look up at the starry sky at night, that's really our library of information on the history of the universe. And it comes from light, and light can tell us two things. One, as you know from your own experience, that when light reflects off of things, it will say something about the composition of those. Different substances give off light at different wavelengths, some absorb light. And so, with the right tools, you can use just the wavelengths of light, the composition of light, to say something about the object that you're looking at. And then light also it moves at a particular speed, so that if we can understand something of the movements of stars in the night sky, we can actually start to tell time as well. So it really is our ability to, track light through telescopes gazing up at the heavens that allows us to know something about its history. And then you ask about gravity. And I've always said that gravity is kind of the architect of the universe, because, gravity is just the attraction of two bodies for each other. And when you have, let's just say, two atoms get attracted together, that makes something that's a little bit larger than the two individuals. So it has a stronger gravitational attraction. And through time, That's what gives rise to stars. That's what will help shape solar systems around stars. So, everything from the formation of the sun to the accretion of the earth owes a big debt to gravity.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating because you talk about these concepts about light and gravity and how they're super important, but then you also talk about how there's much we still don't know and we're still trying to discover, such as dark energy and dark matter. So maybe just kind of just as a little peek into what we may find or what we may discover in studying those two kind of constructs.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is there's an awful lot we don't know about the universe. And that, I am not an astrophysicist, but I have great respect for what we have learned.
Yeah.
But if we take dark matter, when astrophysicists really carefully measured the movements of bodies in the universe relative to each other and sort of summed up the mass of those objects, it turned out it didn't account for the gravitational attractions and things like this. Something was missing. And we don't know what it is that's missing, but it has to be something that has mass, but because we can't see it, it doesn't interact with light. That's not our normal experience of the world. So there has to be something out there that's been christened dark matter. There's more of that than there is conventional matter that we do know something about. And then one of the things that was found out, I'd say about 30, 35 years ago, was that, physicists knew that the universe was expanding, but the expectation would be that through time it would slow down. And it was discovered that, in fact, over the last 8 billion years or so, the rate at which the universe is expanding has actually accelerated. And that required that there's some sort of energy that we don't know about. That's called dark energy. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with dark matter. But the kind of amazing feature is that if you sum up all the stuff of the universe, 95% of it is dark energy and dark matter. And the universe that we know about because of conventional matter is only about 5%. So there are ideas of what those could be, but there's no, I think, real deep understanding of what at heart are probably fundamental features of the universe.
It's almost a terrifying prospect. It's in some ways it's quite wondrous, right? It's like, wow, there's something to be respected about that, and in another part there's something somewhat terrifying about that as well.
Well, I have to admit, as a scientist, I'm actually excited by what we don't know because that's opportunity. I mean, if we knew everything there was to know about the universe, why would you become an astronomer?
Right. There people would be out of jobs. It wouldn't be any point. So yes, I totally, the wonder piece is definitely spectacular. So I guess talk about the composition of the Earth as a whole. So we don't have to go too much into how it took shape and everything, unless it's relevant. But in the book, you talk about the kind of like a hard-boiled egg, right? Using the analogy, right? So we have the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, and the crust. So from a geological perspective, what is the kind of makeup of each of these parts for the Earth, for what we know?
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me say at the beginning that everything that the Earth is, everything that life can be, all the potentialities for how the Earth has functioned through time are really wrapped up in how it formed, because that's where we got all of the elements that we find in the solid, liquid, and gaseous parts of our planet. So if it's true that if you look in the interior of our planet, and there are ways of using earthquake waves the way a doctor uses a CAT scan to look at your body without invading it, that people have been able to figure out that in the very center of the planet is basically a solid ball of iron and a few other things. That's the inner core, and that's surrounded by a zone that's also iron mostly, but that's liquid, and it actually convects or moves through time, which is important because that gives us a magnetic field.
Mm.
And then above that, and really the greatest part of the planetary interior, is something called the mantle. And the mantle is made up of what geologists call silicates, that is, minerals that have silicon dioxide in them, along with magnesium, calcium, iron, you name it. And then only the thinnest veneer on the surface of the Earth is what's called the crust, which has differentiated through time from the mantle. And that crust is what gives us continents, the seafloor. All of the familiar Earth is this little veneer that has differentiated at the top.
It's really spectacular, because when I look at the globe, right, and or if I talk to people that I know, and they'll say like they love to travel the Earth and they like to go to this place and this place and this place. Well, a very wide lens perspective here is that's all of that is still just a thin part of the Earth, of the globe, which is the crust, which is spectacular to think about, right? Because of how much is on the crust of the Earth, and there's so much in the outer core and the mantle and the inner core, which helps keep the planet rotating and things like that. So it is marvelous to think about how things that seem big to us are actually just a small part in the grand scheme of things, which is always humbling in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, we're just living at the surface. To me, the remarkable thing is that clever scientists have figured out how to interrogate what's underneath us. Mm-hmm. So there's a good story in there of just how ingenuity has led to this understanding of what's 3,000 kilometers beneath our feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can, for the next question, you can be as technical as you want. I think much of the listeners are usually big thinkers. They like to get into the details. That's at least the feedback I've got. So one of the things I think that's super important from what we understand about geology is what I remember when I was learning about evolution and so much of how we understand the history and the age of the Earth is in the rocks. It's in ice too and things like that, obviously, but it's in the rocks, right? And that's super important, because there will be people that have dissenting opinions about the Earth is only 10,000 years old, or all of these kinds of alternative opinions. And so I think the geological timestamp is super important. And so you mentioned in the book the Zircons, right? And so how do we know, how do they help us tell geological time? Maybe just explain a little bit of that process. And how do we know by the oxygen in the zircons that there was water on the planet as later or earlier, whichever way you say it, 4.3 billion years ago?
Yeah, so there's two things to say about zircons at the outset. Zircons are minerals that form during the kinds of processes that give rise to granite, the kind of thing you'd see in the Sierra Nevadas or something like that. And zircons are interesting because they can incorporate uranium into the crystal structure of the zircon crystal. Now, so what? Well, it turns out that some forms of uranium are radioactive, and they break down through time to form lead. The next interesting thing about zircon is that although it admits uranium into its lattice, it doesn't admit lead. So if you find lead in a zircon crystal, that lead got there because of apparent uranium isotope that broke down. Now we can actually measure fairly precisely the rate at which uranium breaks down into lead. In fact, there's in detail several chronometers bound up in there. And so then finding in a geological context a zircon, you can measure the uranium, you can measure the lead, and you can calculate the age or the time at which that crystal formed. So it is basically Earth's best timekeeper. It has been used to calibrate the geologic time scale throughout Earth history. And the other thing that's wonderful about zircons is that while we have no rocks that we know of on Earth that are older than 4 billion years, which is about a little more than 500 million years after the Earth formed, we actually have zircon crystals in younger sandstones that are up to 4.4 billion years old. Now, you might ask, well, how can you actually have uh, a crystal that's older than any rock? But as I always tell my students, that if they go up to the North Shore of Massachusetts and look at the sands that are on the beaches, those sands formed by the erosion of the White Mountains in New Hampshire, which have rocks in them that formed 400 million years ago. And if you're have some patience and pick through the grains of sand on a Massachusetts beach, you will find zircons that originated in those mountains. And you have 400 million year old zircons in modern sediments. And so that's how we have these very ancient zircons. And then to answer your final question, that zircons, like many minerals, can actually exchange some of their elements with the environment. And if they exchange with liquid water, that actually leaves a calling card in the form of, again, the isotopes, the different weights of oxygen that are found in the zircon. So zircons are great. They record Earth history, they are chronometers, and they are our one window into what otherwise would be the dark ages of Earth's history.
Mm-hmm. I guess just on an aside here is in terms of time. So when we're looking at these zircon crystals, how do we know that it's not 2 billion as opposed to 4 billion as opposed to 3 billion years in terms of the big scale? How do we know how far back that it goes, right, as opposed to how we have measured the time?
Well, again, because of the fact that the uranium in the zircons will break down to lead at a known rate, that gives us an absolute chronometer. And so I can find zircons that formed 20 million years ago. I can find ones that formed 200 million years ago. And they also, they're a little bit like those things in airplanes that actually record, the flight recorders, that even though the rocks around it may undergo all sorts of processes, zircons are pretty tough to change. So they're very good at recording old ages, if that gets at the question you had.
Yeah, no, I think it, based on the process of how it breaks down, and then you can see, okay, this is from 20 million, this is from 40 million, this is from, that's super helpful to understand, because then it says we can have tangible materials that tell us the time, right? They give us the kind of time clock of when this occurred or when this was happening. Another part of the book that you describe is you talk about the significance of the Sychar Point in Scotland. Sychar Point, yeah, and how do we know in that region where it places us in the Silurian and the Devonian periods, right? So I'm talking about the geological time scale here. How do we know that it's in those periods, and what's the significance about that in terms of Earth's history?
Okay, well, Sychar Point is one of the most famous outcroppings of rock to geologists around the world, because that was the place where James Hutton, the late 18th century father of geology, actually discovered the evidence that confirmed his idea that Earth was very ancient and had changed through time. That was not the conventional thinking of his time, but he was, it was really interesting that like most naturalists in the late 1700s, Hutton would go up into the hills north of Edinburgh where he lived, and he would see that the trees and shrubs and animals there were well suited for those mountains. He'd look down at the Firth of Forth and he would see that the algae and sea anemones were well suited for those environments. But he saw something that nobody else had noticed. He saw that those mountains were gradually wearing down from erosion. And the sediments that were produced by that wearing down were gradually filling in the Firth of Forth. So the question he asked, which was novel at the time, is how can species last for long periods of time if their environment is in a constant state of decay? And he had this brilliant answer for it. He said, well, this mountain will wear down, but somewhere else, something, and he thought it was heat, will raise other mountains. So there's this dynamic continuity to environments that allows species to persist over long time intervals. And so that gave rise to this idea that Earth is constantly changing, that it's very ancient. And when he got to Sicker Point, he saw that there were two sets of sandstones. One was kind of flat lying, but beneath it were other sandstones that were lying on edge and had been, basically scoured away and then filled on top by these flat lying beds. And he knew that those vertical beds had to start out horizontal because they're sediments, and that's how sediments form. And so he had these sediments formed. They must have been contorted by mountain building, then they were eroded, then these other rocks accumulated on time. We know the age of those because they have fossils. Fossils were the original timekeepers, even though at the time they were relative timekeepers. So in a sense, then, Sicker Point encapsulates the idea that when you look at a landscape, there is a potentially very long history that can be read in the materials, orientation, relationships of rocks in that landscape.
Yeah, this is super fascinating. That is quite novel. I can imagine in, the late 18th century that, someone figuring this out and being like, oh, wait a minute, and putting all the pieces together is pretty spectacular, 200 plus years ago. Kind of along those lines, you talk about the formation of the Earth's plates. So kind of how environments will change through time. And so just kind of describe, I think most people will know that obviously the Earth has these plates and that they're shifting, but maybe tell us about, in terms of history, how they're moving over time and how they reflect dynamicism deep within the planet.
Yeah, I think, in 2022, many people at least do know that the Earth's surface is divided up into a dozen or so major plates. Some have continents and oceans, some just have oceans, and that they are moving relative to one another. So because of the mid-ocean ridge, this long mountain chain in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean is actually spreading. It's getting wider by about an inch every year, and that moves North America and Europe apart. And because then North America is moving west, something has to give when it's encountering the Pacific Ocean. And there are movements where part of the Pacific crust is diving down underneath. That's why we have volcanoes and mountains out there. So today it's taken for granted that, these plate movements driven by the mantle underneath it are responsible for ocean basins, mountains, earthquakes, volcanoes, all the major phenomena of our physical planet. What's interesting is that's a fairly recent realization. Although, you can find people going back 200 years who noticed that if you closed up the Atlantic Ocean, the nose of South America would nest in the elbow of Africa. But no one really thought that much about a mobile surface of the planet until in the early 1900s, a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener wrote a book about what he called continental drift, that basically the continents were plowing across the seafloor through time. And basically all the hotshot earth scientists in North America and Europe ridiculed this idea. How could crust move across ocean basins and this sort of thing, until the 1960s. It turned out that the kind of seafloor observations that were made during and following World War II, in World War II, basically to look for German submarines, showed that there was this ocean, or not ocean, but mountain range in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And what was that doing there? And then using ways that can tell you the age of the crust on either side of that ridge, you could see it was very young at the ridge and got older as you went away from the ridge. So it was really in the 1960s that different people added parts of the puzzle, so that by 1970 or so, there was this entirely new revolutionary idea of how the Earth works, and that's plate tectonics.
It's wild how that's 50 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I was in college.
That's wild. That's so wild that it was like 50 years ago. It wasn't like 300 years ago. It wasn't, some, explorer in 16 something. It was 50 years ago. I mean, it's wild to me. And in terms of the tectonic plates, as you're mentioning, so how do they shape, right? How do they have the makeup of the Earth? And how does it look different as opposed to, say, a planet like Mars, right? So how do the tectonic plates look on the Earth relative to other planets we may know?
Okay, well, let's make a comparison of Earth and Mars.
Okay.
Earth has these plates with boundaries. Some places they are diving back into the mantle, and we get lines of volcanoes. Like, you can run from the Aleutians down through Japan, down to the Philippines and Indonesia, and that's where the crust is disappearing. Other places, the crust is opening up and moving continents. And if you look at the Earth, what's interesting about the crust is it comes in two flavors. The seafloor is covered by something called basalt. It's the kind of rock you'd find if you went to Hawaii and looked at the volcanoes. The continents, on the other hand, are made of a more buoyant material, very similar to granite. Again, you can find granite in almost any mountain range you care to look at. Granite actually forms under these conditions where ocean crust starts diving back into the mantle. It melts in a way that differentiates the materials and forms granite. So with that in mind, here we are. We live on a planet that has continents made of granite, seafloor made of basalt, and continental plates. Mars has neither of those things. There's no evidence that Mars has or ever has had anything like plate tectonics. There is very, very little differentiation of the crust on Mars, so it's pretty much, nearly all basalt and basalt-like minerals. So Mars, our closest neighbor, probably one of the planets most similar to us, is fundamentally different in that it never developed the features that really characterize the Earth.
I have two questions on that. So
Sure.
Does that mean that one, so people say that, Mars could have looked different millions of years ago, and now it's a red planet. It's all sand and dust. But maybe it was, I don't want to say an ocean planet, but it had water, things like that. Does that have any relevance in terms of the fact that it has just these types of kinds of rocks that you're describing, or has no bearing on that?
Well, they're related in a sense. What one can say about Mars is that it's not quite a dead planet now, but it doesn't have the dynamic interior that drives plate motions on Earth. You're absolutely right that in Mars missions that have happened, over the last 20 years, it's become clear that Mars once was wetter than it is now. I had the good fortune of being on one of the science teams for Mars missions, and it's exciting to work on those rocks. But it's not clear to me that if you had taken a rocket ship to Mars 4 billion years, you would have seen giant, long-lasting oceans. My guess is that there was water sometimes, and then it would kind of get cold and dry. And then we get some more water, then it would get cold and dry. And that would be largely driven by volcanism and impact from meteorites. So in a sense, we can overplay the card of similarity between early Mars and Earth. I think it is remarkable that we now know enough from ground level observations to reconstruct the history of another planet. And to me, while it gives us a distant mirror on the Earth, it shows us that Earth is pretty spectacular and unique.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely unique, and the fact that we have one of the crazy things that I've learned in talking with different people is that it almost seems that whatever extinctions we have or whatever happens with different periods of the Earth, you have a kind of a mass extinction or some event, and life finds a way again. And then there's another explosion of life, right? This was obviously in the Cambrian. This was at many different points in our Earth's history. And I wonder if other planets maybe do not have that. Similarly, if there's these different kinds of ways in which there's different composites of how the ocean floor is here on Earth, and then how certain mountain structures are, as you were explaining, and Mars doesn't have both of those, it might seem that maybe humans couldn't live on Mars, right? Unless there's some kind of terraforming or things like that. But maybe it seems less likely that humans could live on Mars if they don't have the same properties and that Earth does. Would you say that that's kind of still speculative, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think Matt Damon growing potatoes on the Martian surface aside, I think without technology, humans would last 5 minutes on Mars. It has a very thin atmosphere. There's not much oxygen. There's little or no water. It's cold. It's a really nasty place.
Mm-hmm.
It's an open question as to whether some sort of microbial life might have taken root 4 billion years ago. But to the broader question that you raise, in some ways, what might be remarkable about life on Earth is not that it began, but that it has persisted for 4 billion years.
Yeah.
And you're right, it has persisted through all sorts of changes and insults from super volcanoes and meteorites and that. And those have been important agents of change. Humans like to think this giant meteor that killed the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago was wonderful because it allowed mammals then to radiate. Of course, that's telling the story from the perspective of mammals and not dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, and in our, we'll talk about the 21st century later, but, as far as humans are concerned, anything that disappears now is gone forever. Mm-hmm. So it's, yes, it is true that the various physical events that modify Earth's surface remove some biological diversity, and then over millions of years, there is new diversity that takes shape, and that's a remarkable feature of our planet.
Yeah, it is truly remarkable. I'm currently reading the book Other Lands by Halliday, which is really fantastic. It's a great book. So on that, how do you, we were talking about kind of, life in some sense on Mars and on Earth. So I guess you talk about it in the book, but how do you define life? And why is that definition really important to understanding, what we are looking for on other planets, right? If life is just microbes, okay, maybe we're not going to find green men on other planets. Maybe we will, but how do we define life, and why is how we define it really important?
Yeah, life, lots of people have tried to define life. Probably more physicists do that than biologists. Mm-hmm. And, many people feel that defining life is a little bit like Potter Stewart's famous statement in the Supreme Court about pornography, that he couldn't define it, but he knew it when he saw it. And I think that's the way a lot of people think about life. We know that organisms, at least that we know about, take in materials and energy from the environment and use that to grow and reproduce. And that gives us something of a functional definition of life. A guy named Jerry Joyce at the Scripps Institute in California once defined life as a chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution, which I like that definition because it really does emphasize what is different about you and me from a quartz crystal. Quartz crystals grow, quartz crystals take in materials from their environment, but they don't evolve. And so that's that. Now, that then raises the question of, let's look for life elsewhere in the universe. First, there's a question of how representative of life in the universe is the one example we know about, which is us. And I think there are things that probably are representative. My guess is if we find life on the planet Remulon, it will be based on carbon. It will have a metabolism because energy is similar on other planets. So when we look for evidence of life, much the way as a paleontologist I look for evidence of past life in rocks, we do it based on features of life that we don't know to be shared by just physical systems. So if I find an amino acid on Mars that's indigenous, that doesn't help me because any junior high school kid can make amino acids in the laboratory from simple precursors. On the other hand, if you find cholesterol there, then I'm pretty interested because we don't know of ways that those complex molecules can be made by physical processes alone. So on planets like Mars or moons of Jupiter and Saturn, where we can go ourselves, we can actually look for the physical and chemical fingerprints of life, past or present. If we go to planets around other stars that are at least fairly close to us, we can start looking at their atmospheres and ask whether they have compositions that are best interpreted by the presence of biology on the planet. But for most of the universe, the only way we're ever going to know whether there's life out there is if they tell us. So, intelligent life may be the rarest form of life in the universe, but it may be the only one that we can know about at great distances from ourselves.
Yeah, it's still something that fascinates us and bothers us and gives us wonder, and we still search for it. But I think that probably likely that there is some of the biological aspects, such as microbes or things like that, likely could be out there. In terms of on Earth, when, where do we know when earliest life began? Right? Is it 3.5 billion years? Is it 4.1 billion years? And maybe talk about the significance of the Spitsbergen rocks and why that's super important for telling us when life began.
Oh, well, I use the example of Spitsbergen often in my writing and speaking, just because that's a place where I worked, particularly when I was younger and fitter than I am now. And it's a good place for showing how, to back up, it's pretty easy for people to imagine how dinosaurs can leave a record of their bones or a clam can leave a record of its shell, but how do microbes leave a record? Well, it turns out they can leave a pretty darn good record. We can find actual fossils of ancient cells that are preserved in the rock record. Microbial communities on the seafloor can actually build up and make reefs, microbial reefs called stromatolites. We can see those because they're well preserved. There are chemical signatures of life, and we can follow those backward through time by looking at successively older sedimentary rocks back to 3.5 billion years. At 3.5 billion years, we have pretty much the oldest sedimentary rocks that have not been strongly altered by temperature and pressure. We have them in both Australia and Southern Africa, and they contain evidence of microbial life. There was a biological carbon cycle, a biological sulfur cycle back then. And if you go back from there, there's some what geologists call metamorphosed rocks at 3.8 billion years old. That is, they were once sediments, but they've been subjected to high heat and pressure. But they have carbon in them that has a chemical fingerprint that in younger rocks would be interpreted as life. So the interesting observation is that as we go backward in time, we run out of rocks before we run out of evidence of life. So we don't really know precisely when life began, but we have confidence that Earth has been a biological planet for most of its history.
This is the part of me that I think most people also maybe can identify with is, how do, I don't want to ask the why, but how do we find that life starts? What would be the ideas of how life is beginning, starting with microbial life all the way up to, multicellular organisms. What would, is some of this stuff just the right environment and randomization, and then we just get the ball rolling and we're just keep going? Or what can you make of why or how it could be that life begins?
Well, there is an experimental field that asks this question. One of the real pioneers in thinking about the origin of life was a man named Stanley Miller, who, as a graduate student in 1953, did a very interesting experiment. He just took a flask with water in it and added ammonia, hydrogen gas, water, and natural gas, methane, CH4. And then he thought that was what the early Earth's atmosphere was like. And then he wanted to simulate lightning going through that atmosphere. So he put an electrical discharge through his flask. And by George, when he started doing that, the walls of the flask started turning brown. And when he then analyzed what was happening, he had actually produced amino acids, the stuff of proteins in them. And, that gave the first experimental confirmation that the building blocks of life could be synthesized by, materials and processes that were plausible in the early history of planets. And so there's been a lot of work since then. If you think that evolution is the sine qua non of life, it was just announced very recently from a Japanese team doing experiments that they have sort of RNA molecules, one of the nucleic acids in your body, that can actually grow, replicate themselves, and evolve and diversify to serve different functions. If you can do that, you're kind of knocking on the door of life. And again, that isn't to say that we understand everything. There's a lot we don't know. Sure. But I think we can see broadly how processes on the early Earth would have given rise to simple microbial life. And then, that has persisted. And through evolution, we get more complex cells, we get multicellularity. And for better or for worse, at some point, we get us.
Right. Yeah, right. I have a technical question here. So one of the things that I've become maybe it's just the visual component, or maybe just the kind of epochs that it's separated in, but I love the geologic timescale. And so for listeners, you have the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, which is inclusive of the Phanerozoic, and so you have this separated by eons, eras, and periods. And so you have as I've mentioned, the Cambrian, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and all the way up to the current period. All of that falls under one particular eon. I guess just how did this kind of come about? Like, how did the geological timescale come about? I find it very helpful, and when you're talking about millions and millions of years ago, it's really hard to kind of just like jump between periods, and so having periods to jump to is much easier. So I guess just how did it come about? In organizing it.
Yeah, this really arose in the early 19th century. And it came through the study of fossils. So there was a man named William Smith, who was a surveyor for canals being built during the beginning of the industrial age in the UK. And he found that he would see successive beds of rocks as they dredged for these canals. And he always saw that each bed in these successions had particular fossils in. And the fossils changed in what turned out to be a predictable manner. And so he thought, well, this will allow me then to correlate rocks of the same type and age from one place to another. And building on that, by the early 1820s, people had looked at, packages of rocks. So a guy named Adam Sedgwick looked at a package of rocks in Wales that had particular trilobites and was distinct. And he said, well, I'm going to call those rocks, that package, the Cambrian system. And the time represented by those rocks would be the Cambrian period. And, by the middle of the 19th century, the periods of the Phanerozoic eon, which is basically the interval in which we have animal life, had pretty much been lined out, and they were based on the comings and goings of fossil species through time. We knew that the Silurian period came before the Devonian period. We didn't know how old either of them was, and it wasn't until the discovery of radioactivity at the end of the 19th century, and then through time its application to the geologic record, that we had a sense not only of relative time but of absolute time. And to finish up the discussion, early on it was really the periods of the last 540 million years that were sort of mapped in great detail, and everything else, so-called Precambrian time, was kind of a terra incognita. But slowly, that world has come to light through both biological, chemical, and radioactive means, so that, again, I had the pleasure of chairing an international working group that actually defined a new period beneath the Cambrian, now called the Ediacaran. That was the first period to be defined by, conventional geological criteria since the 19th century. And now people are building this back. So it's just a matter of really understanding what characterizes rocks of different ages, having things that we know can differentiate rocks of one age from another, and then calibrating them with radiometric ages.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, because many people will talk about the various periods starting from the Cambrian, but many people talk about periods previous to that, the Precambrian, right, which I think also have different periods to them, right? You have the Hadean period, and you have the Mesoarchean and the Neoarchean. You have all these different types of periods, no?
Yeah, well, they're big chunks of time. And at the moment, most of those are just defined by ages. So, if it's 2.5 to 2.8 billion years old, it's Neoarchean. What's happening now, because the geologic timescale is a work in progress, is that there are commissions seeing if we really think these are distinctive intervals of time, we should be able to characterize them in terms of things you see in the rocks. So to a first approximation, the Archean, the really old Earth, can be differentiated from the Proterozoic from about 2.5 billion to a little more than 500 million years ago by the fact that there's oxygen in the atmosphere in the Proterozoic, something we can tell because of its geological calling cards. So slowly, not only is the timescale getting finer and finer in young intervals of time, but our understanding of history is getting sufficiently good for the early Earth that we can start, subdividing it the way the younger rocks have been through time.
And I guess kind of going towards the earlier periods, what is usually the kind of, this might be too in the weeds, but what is usually the kind of cutoffs? Okay, this period starts and this one ends, right? How do we have the Cretaceous and then the Paleogene and the Neogene? How do we know this starts and this stops and this starts, rather?
That's a good question. So let's take the Cambrian period, the first period of the Phanerozoic eon. That is defined by a point in a section of rock in Newfoundland where we first start seeing a particular type of fossil, in fact, a trace fossil, a track and trail of early animals. And that defines the beginning of the Cambrian. We then see that there are specific fossils that occur in beds above that, and those are used to tell that rocks are Cambrian and not Ordovician and that. If we then look beneath the Cambrian, the beginning of the preceding period, the Ediacaran period, is defined by the rapid collapse of a global ice age 630 million years ago. So the Ediacaran is defined by the beginning is defined by that event. The end is defined by the beginning of the Cambrian, and everything in between can be used to characterize Ediacaran time.
So it sounds like there has to be something distinctly different, or maybe not an event, but a a much different pattern of things, whether they're fossils or certain things in the rocks that say this is distinctly, or markedly different from these beds or these patches of rocks, to say this could possibly be another period to mark that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so the most of the younger periods were defined by fossils, in fact, fossil animals. In older intervals of time, more emphasis has been placed on globally, significant chemical changes. But those have proven so useful that now people are going back and looking at some of the younger boundaries and say, wow, there's some interesting chemical changes here too. So that actually supplements the fossils we've traditionally used.
The last question on this, and you don't have to make any public statements if you don't want to. I know it's quasi controversial, that we're living in an Anthropocene period. And from what I understand, is that people fight about this, right? Some people like it, some people don't like it. I guess what can we make of it? I'll just say generally like that.
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about Anthropocene. I think because it calls attention to the distinct interval of our planet's history that we have entered now because of human activities, I think it's a useful term. But if we're actually defining an Anthropocene epoch, then you have to do the kind of thing that happens at the beginning of the Cambrian, say, this event or this fossil or whatever it is how we define it. And there's been a lot of back and forth about, do we define it by, the first appearance of Edsels in the geologic record or something like this, or, how do we do it? And there's not a lot of agreement on that, in part because it is not like humans started influencing the earth only in the industrial age. There's evidence that humans had an effect on the distribution of vegetation, for example, 40,000 years ago in Europe, and that. So human influence has been on this planet since humans first appeared. And of course, it really accelerates beginning in the late 18th, early 19th century. And, most of the fossil fuels ever burned have been burned since World War II. So, we are the time we live in now is astonishing in many ways. So I think the controversy is not on the idea that because of humans we live in a distinctive interval of our planet's history, but just how do you define it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I'm not. Maybe it's just the kind of structural person that I am, but the geologic timescale is just, I don't know, something's very fascinating about it for me. Kind of towards the second part, I guess, of your book, you talk about a variety of things. So you talk about Misfortune Point, right? And so what's the significance of this place for telling us about certain periods of the Earth? So kind of along the lines we were just discussing. Yeah. What's significant here?
So Misfortune Point is a World Heritage Site in southeastern Newfoundland. It's a spectacular place in these great sea cliffs along the Atlantic Ocean. And if you go there, you'll see there are exposures of what are called bedding planes or bedding surfaces. That is, you're not just looking at cross sections through rocks, you're looking at the surfaces, what you could have walked over at the time they formed. And because of volcanic activity at the time, these beds preserve the oldest known animals, basically where they lived. It's been called a paleontological Pompeii, and that's about right. So if you want to see our earliest evidence of macroscopic animal life, that's where you go, and it's really an astonishing place.
Which period is this, or which period? So
the actual age is 565 million years old, because you can date the volcanic rocks; they have zircons in them, and that would put you in the upper part of the so-called Ediacaran period, just before the Cambrian.
Wow, wow. And you talk about the second part of the book, you talk about kind of many animals and plant lives. And as we move forward in time, different periods and different aspects. So you talk about the Ediacaran period. Am I saying this right?
Yeah.
And so what is unique about the animals that were alive in this period? And maybe you can give a few examples if you like.
Well, they're really distinctive. I've always thought of them as kind of a paleontological Rorschach test, because when you get to the Cambrian period that follows, you look at a fossil and say that's an arthropod because I can see its structural similarities to shrimps and lobsters.
Uh-huh.
I can see that this is a clam or something like that. The earliest animals don't look like any of those things. They're quite distinctive. Most of them look like, if you remember the air mattresses you might have used when you camped out as a kid, where you get these sort of air-filled sausages, if you will. That's kind of what they look like. There was very little to them other than upper and lower surfaces and some sort of fluid in between them. Now you say, well, gosh, that sounds very different from animals that I know. True. On the other hand, there's a tiny little animal that exists in the oceans today called Trichoplax, which is, it's the sole representative of the phylum Placozoa. Itty bitty thing, millimeter long, but it consists of an upper and lower layer of cells with fluid in between. It feeds because its cells on the surface can either engulf particles like a protozoan would or absorb dissolved organic matter. So it doesn't have a mouth, it doesn't have a digestive system, this sort of thing. It doesn't have lungs or gills. It exchanges gas by diffusion. And you know what? Except for size, that's a pretty good description of the Ediacaran fossils. Wow. So I think the Ediacarans are a first blast of diversification of animals at a time when the structures of existing animals were still very simple.
I mentioned in the book earlier, Other Lands, that I'm reading, and it's interesting because it seems as if you were to jump in a time machine and go to different periods of the Earth would look like a different planet at certain points almost. It would look so different from what we know today in some sense. It would look, where continents are and are not, how many are there, how much water there is or how much less, what the atmosphere is doing in terms of, a lot of carbon or a lot of oxygen, all of these different things that are different for the environment, and then what types of living organisms are on the planet at that time. The Earth would look so different. It would almost look like a completely different place. And so it's interesting that this period, it sounds so different than what we know Earth to be today. It's like, how is that the same planet? It's just very fascinating.
But that's the beauty of the whole thing. If you had been around in the 19th century when these pioneering geologists noticed that there was this succession of fossils, I think they would have accepted the idea that the physical Earth just sat there and life changed through time around it. Now we know that both the physical and biological Earth have changed through time. And I've basically made my living for the last several decades trying to understand that interplay. When does life actually influence the environment? When does the environment push life in one direction or another? And it's a story that will certainly outlast my work, but it really is, I think, what's fundamental about the history of our planet.
Yeah. You also mentioned photosynthesis and oxygen as key for animals to evolve on the planet coming out of the Ediacaran period. Just kind of tell us about kind of the environment and how that's also super important for this period.
Yeah, and oxygen is the best example I think we have of this interplay between Earth and life. I can begin by saying if you had been placed on the Earth's surface at any time before about 600 million years ago, you would have suffocated because there wasn't much oxygen. In fact, we know from geological and geochemical records that probably for the first billion or more years of life on Earth, there was no oxygen. And it's only about 2.4 to 2.2 billion years ago that the atmosphere and surface ocean accumulated even a little bit of oxygen. It was probably only 1% or so of today's levels. And then, interestingly, we start the rise toward today's high levels of oxygen about the time when we first start seeing animals. So there is this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then to bring it on home to biology, there's really only one source of oxygen that's capable of oxygenating our planet, and that's photosynthesis, where plants take CO2, they take water and actually extract electrons from it to make that CO2 into sugars. And the byproduct of that, if you're using water as your source of electrons, is oxygen. So photosynthesis at heart is what has really made the whole biological history of the last 2.5 billion years possible.
Yeah, it's incredible, and it's something that, I mean, I know I do. I know maybe probably lots of other people do. It's something I take for granted, every day, right?
Yeah.
Is the fact that I'm breathing air and it's fine. And right, 600 million years ago, we suffocate, wouldn't have been able to. We wouldn't have been able to survive. And it's fascinating how, again, the Earth looks fundamentally different in ways that things that can occur now couldn't have occurred 500 million plus years ago. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, no, I'm actually writing a paper right now that essentially makes the argument that if you want to understand the history of animal life, you have to understand the history of the photosynthetic organisms that shape the planet around them. And if you want to understand them, you have to understand how tectonics and things like that actually, govern how much photosynthesis you can do. So again, it's the more we know about the Earth, the more we have to think about it as an integrated system and can't understand the parts independently of one another.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating how it all connects, and then once you kind of get a good overview, then you start to really you can't unsee it. You kind of just see how everything works. We've mentioned the Cambrian, which is huge. So this is at 540 million-ish years ago, and so maybe just unpack it a little bit more. Why is that a period that people talk about a lot? Why is it so important as this huge transitional period for the Earth and for living organisms? What made it so explosive, I guess?
Yeah, well, I have a good perspective on this because for many years, the bulk of my field research was on rocks before the Cambrian. And, it's mostly microbial, even 20 million years, 25 million years before the beginning of the Cambrian, you see these sort of alien animals. And then you get up into Cambrian rocks and you see this accumulation of things that look familiar. And so all of the major body plans of animals that we see today, what are called phyla by biologists, we see their first representation in the fossil record in the Cambrian. So in that way, not only is it when we first see evidence of the diversification of animal life to produce at least the skeletons of the diversity we see today, but that happens when you're 85% of the way through the history of life. So it's, in terms of Earth history, it's a relatively recent event that really reshapes biology on the planet.
Yeah, it is a really, anytime I've read about this period right before and then during the Cambrian, it's always a period that's it just happens, and it's so different from what it was, and it's how it is relatively younger. As you move further into different periods, you talk about in the book the Rhynia and why that's important to help us to understand the shift from water to plant life on land. That's super important. So how to just briefly mention that and what time frame that's working in.
Yeah, I think one of the things to realize is that photosynthesis evolved in water, and it works really well in water. But if you take a photosynthetic organism, an alga, for example, and put it out on dry land, it will basically dehydrate, and it'll die because of desiccation. So if plants were to get out onto land, they had to evolve features that would allow them to persist on land, to keep from desiccating while still taking in CO2 for photosynthesis, to keep ways of actually obtaining nutrition or nutrients from the ground. And we get a sense of how that happened from comparative biology, because we do have a diversity of life today that tells us something about it. But the fossil record, particularly this remarkable deposit in Scotland called the Rhynie Chert, it's a snapshot of land plants when they're just getting going, and shows very nicely how through time we get the features that allow photosynthetic life larger than microbes to live on Earth. And of course, once that happens, then we start seeing evidence that animals are coming out on land. So even before Rhynie time, we see evidence that there were scorpion-like organisms making it out onto land. There are very early insects in the Rhynie Chert, some other so-called invertebrate groups. And really within about 30 million years of that, we see our first evidence that vertebrates, our ancestors in the form of amphibians, had figured out how to live and work on land.
Yeah, so kind of tell us about the tetrapods and the vertebrates and how they evolved, right? And how do we know of other intermediary species such as Tiktaalik? So I talked to Neil Shubin a couple months ago, and obviously Tiktaalik is his baby, right? That's him and his team. They found this marvelous animal, and was super helpful in helping us understand. It's in the Silurian or Devonian period, somewhere in there.
Devonian, right?
And that's like the huge, mystery, right? Of like, how did we get from water to land? Like, how did that happen, right? And so Tiktaalik is super important and all that. But what else do we know about vertebrates and maybe other intermediary species as well in this period of transition?
Yeah, well, if you look at just life today, it turns out that the closest relatives of land vertebrates, that is all the things with four legs that run around on the land surface, are something called lungfish. And lungfish, they're fish, there's no question about it, but they've actually modified one of their organs, called a swim bladder, to be a lung. And so they can come out and survive on land. They have their fins are a bit different from those of conventional fish, and you can see in that the kind of structure that would end up supporting legs on land. And so the question then for the geologic record is, we have some close sisters of land vertebrates. We have land vertebrates today. You could make a list of the things that have to change to get from one to the other. And the remarkable thing, as Neil's work and the work of others shows, is that there's a series of intermediates that connect the dots, if you will. So sometimes, critics have said, well, you never find intermediates in the fossil record. Well, you do. One of my favorite stories actually involves Neil talking to some grade school kids, and he asked them when they're looking at this Tiktaalik skeleton whether it was a fish or an amphibian, and one of the kids says, "Looks like both," which was the point. And it really is a wonderful story that shows how body plans that allowed, in this case, vertebrates to colonize a whole new set of environments on land came to be. And you can tell similar stories for other, I would say that at least 11 or 12 times different groups of animals have gained the land. And for at least some of them, we have a good enough fossil record that helps us to understand their origins. Just the way, a bit later when animals take to the air, we have, 30 or 40 different species now that connect dinosaurs to birds. And you can really see in a sense of functional biology how that happened.
It's always interesting. I've talked to a few ornithologists on the podcast and a few biologists, and it's almost like now, I remember when I was younger, people were like, well, maybe birds are kind of like some version of a dinosaur, but people were like, maybe not, and weren't sure. And now it's like every time I talk to an ornithologist, they're like, birds are dinosaurs, like full stop. Like we know this now, the birds are dinosaurs. And, I said it before, but every time now when I go outside and, I'm sitting outside at a restaurant or I'm outside in my yard and I just see, birds flying around. I look at their movements, I look at how they're functioning, their behaviors, and it's like, I only see dinosaurs now. I don't see I don't see birds, which is funny. Talk about a little bit of the evolution of soil for the geology of the earth, right? And so and for animals on the planet, how important was this evolution here? Because obviously we have soil now, different types of soil. What was instrumental about this?
Yeah, soil has often, and for good reason, been called the greatest natural resource on Earth. Soil it keeps water where plants can get at it. It provides nutrients. It stores carbon, and it's largely a biological construct. That is, there was no soil of the type you would see now if you took a shovel out into your backyard. Before, plants, animals, and importantly, fungi, protozoa, bacteria formed these new ecosystems on dry land. And then through time, they end up, chemically weathering and decomposing rocks, freeing up nutrients, cycling nutrients through the soil, holding on water. And yes, that then not only allows plants to evolve, but plants develop larger roots, they grow taller, and soil, as I say, it is something that has both been made possible by plants, but in turn makes much of plant life and other life on land possible and persist.
Yeah. I think it's again something that people don't think about as often. I had a fabulous conversation last year with Patrick Roberts, who wrote this book called Jungle, and he talks about all about the history of the Earth through tropical forests. And he mentions a little bit of soil, he mentions ferns, and he mentions many, many tropical forests. It's fascinating to think about different aspects. People talk about, kind of the popular themes, right? Such as, the asteroid and dinosaurs and other, parts of the Earth's history and popular culture. But there are many things, many perspectives, I guess you could say, about the history of the Earth that are super important. Along those lines, we've had at least 5 major extinctions. Some people say we're living in the 6th, unfortunately. And there are many other things that have happened. So, obviously we've talked about the Cambrian explosion, but then we've had, the Carboniferous period, which was a really tough time for the planet. We had the Great Dying with the Permian, obviously the asteroid hitting at the Cretaceous, et cetera. There's all this, death, rebirth kinds of things. And so just from a geological perspective, how does this impact the Earth? Again, we're talking over millions and billions of years, but all of this change and how we understand it, right? And maybe there are other things we haven't yet discovered, but how does this just impact the Earth, kind of the gestalt, the whole picture here a little bit, negatively or positively?
I think maybe a way to introduce an answer to that question is to ask how representative of Earth through time is what we see around us today. 100 years ago, I think most people would have said, well, the animals and plants are different, but the Earth is pretty much the same. But now we know that's not true. In some ways, we live in an end member state of the Earth. We have volcanism today. We understand it. But 252 million years ago, there was volcanism 1 million times greater than anything ever witnessed by human beings. So, just the scale of things that happen at rare intervals in the past shows that we haven't experienced everything there is is to experience. So in a sense, the Earth has been shaped by these events. It's further shaped by the extinctions and then subsequent diversification of plants and animals surrounding extinction events. I think for the long-term trajectory of history, these events that have caused mass extinctions have probably had a larger footprint on life than they have on the physical Earth. Although these are major events, but they're transient, and then the Earth relaxes back to a more normal state, if you will. But the life is changed forever by these events.
The one thing that's interesting here is that I haven't, as important as it is, I haven't talked too much with folks on the podcast about climate change. It's not because I don't find it important or it's not an important topic. I will say it is hard to find good people to talk honestly about it. There's a lot of bad faith actors, I think, out there. And I also think that it's important with this topic to discuss it from folks that are close to the science of it, that have training and expertise in it. So I've heard people talk about it, but they don't have, not that you necessarily need it, but they don't have background or experience or degrees in earth sciences, right? And so that's kind of important when you're talking about the planet. I don't think it's required, maybe you see otherwise, but the last few questions I have are about climate change and the Earth's climate. So I guess the way I want to tee it up is kind of going all the way back at the beginning of the conversation. We talked about the Earth, the hard, boiled egg and all that stuff, right? And as the analogy, and we talked about the crust of the Earth, and we talked about the mantle and all these things. The Earth's climate has changed multiple times in the past, right? We talked about this, right? Throughout the Earth's 4.6 billion years or whatever, it's changed many times, different ice ages, etc. So why is the climate change now so significant? And how is that? So just that question alone, divorced of human involvement. So I'll ask about human involvement afterwards, but just on that alone, right? I know maybe that might be hard to parse out, but the Earth's always changing. It's always moving. It's always in flux. The climate's always there. What makes this climate change now so significant? And then we can talk about human involvement.
Yeah, it's all a question of rate. So it is absolutely true that Earth's climate has fluctuated dramatically over millions of years, but generally in a fairly stately fashion. Those short intervals of Earth history where environment has changed rapidly are in fact what we recognize as mass extinctions. So if climate changes slowly, life can, organisms can migrate, they can adapt. If climate or the environment in any way changes rapidly, then that can be a dangerous time for life. So it's all, I would say that Earth's climate is changing at a geologically unusual pace right now. It's much faster than really anything in the last 50 million years, I would say.
And so I would tend to agree. That's kind of my read on things as well. Is the rate? It's too fast, too soon. So how much can we actually say concretely or confidently that responsibility of that rate of change is on humans, right? And how much it's the natural course of the Earth is taking is, look, if humans were not destroying the planet as they're doing in various ways, which we'll get to in a minute, would we say this would still happen? Or maybe that's a hypothetical, but how much can we put the responsibility on humans?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things to say. First is that we've got lots of measurements of climate change. So we know with a fair amount of precision how much the Earth has warmed since the beginning of the last century. We have measurements over the last 70 million years of the CO2 content of Earth's atmosphere. It's about 30% higher today than it was when I was born. We know from simple, atmospheric physics and experiments that CO2 makes things warmer. It's a greenhouse gas, and it's one of the real climate regulators of this planet. So CO2 going up explains the observations that, not only the temperature is going up, but that glaciers are melting, that sea level is rising. So the question is, why is CO2 going up? And here again, these isotopes come into play, because not only have we measured through time the amount of CO2 that is in the atmosphere, but we have measurements of the carbon in that CO2. And what they tell us is that the only source, well, it's the major source of the CO2 that is responsible for climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. You can say, well, maybe the ocean is releasing CO2, but that has the wrong isotopic composition. You can also say, well, maybe the sun is just, we know the sun varies through time. But again, we have pretty good measurements of solar luminosity over the last 100 years, and they don't begin to explain what we're seeing. So I think from, looking at all the possible drivers of climate change, is there more volcanism? Well, no, and I wouldn't explain it if there were. Is there more release from the ocean? No, that won't explain it. Is there more luminosity from the sun? No, that won't explain it. The only way you can line up all the things we can measure and see is that human activities, mainly fossil fuel burning and a not insignificant contribution from land use change and burning of forests, is responsible for the CO2 that makes the Earth warmer. It's also responsible for the change in pH of the oceans, which is bad news for corals, things like this. So, I don't say this as a political argument. It is simple observation that the climate is changing rapidly, and it is human activities that are responsible for it.
Yeah. I think you explain it well. I think I haven't heard it described that clearly in a while. So I think that's important for listeners to hear. Many people talk about climate change in the abstract, but outside of CO2. So you've laid that out very nicely in how more fossil fuels and CO2 in the atmosphere is a major contributing problem. But what are some of the other aspects of climate change, or what are some of the other impacts, I should say, of climate change outside of CO2? People hear that point often, but you mentioned habitat disruption, pollution, overexploitation, failing ecosystems, obviously the acidification of the oceans, etc. So there's CO2, but what would you say are some of 3 or 4 or 5 other big problems we're currently facing as a result of the climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think we hear so much about climate change that it masks other important human activities. So again, there have been these, I think, rather sobering surveys of just populations of animals around the world, and they're plummeting. All over the world, fish, snakes, birds, mammals, you name it. There have been a small number of extinctions so far of animals. Coral reefs are in big decline. I just saw yesterday that it's estimated that just in the past decade, something like 15% of all the corals and coral reefs have died. And most of that was not from climate change. That's the interesting thing. Over the last 100 years, pollution, land use change, and let's be honest that we need agricultural land. We couldn't persist as a species with 8 billion people without it. But every time you convert a forest to a field, that has consequences. So pollution, overexploitation of species, a great majority of all fisheries in the oceans are at or beyond their sustainable levels of yield. And so that's really whittled away at nature and biological diversity. And now climate change is accelerating. And those other things aren't going away, but now they're going to happen along with major changes in climate. And also, it's worth mentioning that one of the real consequences is sea level change, just because you melt ice sheets, and actually water that's warmer is less dense, so it expands. And so, I think anyone who lives in coastal Florida and is not worried about environmental change is going to have a comeuppance. If you live in coastal Florida, you're going to see that sea level come up. It's already flooding historical aquifers with salt water. We're just at the beginning of accelerated change, and it's going to affect water availability. If you live in the southwestern United States, water is going to be an increasingly big issue. Many places in the world, not just in California, more extreme weather is leading to more fires. If you live in the northeastern United States and eastern Canada, as I do, the frequency of large, really damaging hurricanes is expected to increase. So there are many aspects of life that will change markedly, so that the world that your grandchildren inhabit may well be very different from ours.
The counter I hear to this is, I mean, I don't find it convincing, but this is the counter is, yeah, we've heard that since the 60s, by the year 2000, this and this and this. And yes, we all saw Al Gore's film and, whenever it came out, 2004 or 3, whenever it came out. Yes, we the doomsday, scientists are, saying this, and then some conspiracy theorists say that there's some big, large scale propaganda mission or something. But, I think there's some legitimacy of, look, it's been 40 or 50 years or longer than that we've been talking about this. And, yes, there's changes. Yes, I think most people, if they're honest, would admit to it. But, no one's needing to move to high ground. Is this really just, yeah, it's changing. Yes, there's human impact, but, maybe 100, 200 years from now, I mean, people try to minimize this way. And I don't find these arguments convincing. But what do you say, I guess, to folks that are like, I'm tired of hearing about like the world's ending tomorrow? How do you kind of factually press upon some urgency without being doomsday, the world's ending tomorrow?
Yeah, well, I think fortunately newspapers are starting to help us here. If you look at the Great Barrier Reef, where they have had, these so-called bleaching events where corals lose their algal symbionts. It used to happen once a decade and the corals would heal. Now it's happened 4 times in the last 5 years and is just destroying the reefs. There have been forest fires in California. They're a lot bigger now. And then, there was just the other day, an ice shelf collapsed in Antarctica. So I understand that people get tired of hearing doom and gloom. And actually, most conservation biologists that I know have long ago stopped just dealing in doom and gloom, but rather than saying, we have an opportunity here to vouchsafe things for our children. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for those points of view. And I will say that one thing I hear is that this is all a scientific hoax. And let me tell you, if I could actually demonstrate that climate change was not real, I would become the most famous scientist in the world. But I can't do it because it is real. And I think when you have your head in the sand, you can't really see very well around you. And so I would just to close off, I'd just say, look what's in the newspapers. Look what's changing. I mean, there were temperatures in the Antarctic in the past month that were something like 40 degrees higher than normal. I mean, this is unprecedented.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing that's convincing for me is how fast it's happening and how much it's accelerating in such a short time frame is what's worrisome. That's really what's worrisome in my mind, and I think that you cannot help but see human involvement, especially with there's 8 billion of us and how much we consume and things like that. I guess one question here, since much of the book has been on a lot of geology, what's what's climate change's impact on the Earth's geology, and how do we know that, and can we know that, or can we measure that of what it's doing to the crust and the mantle and different environments and regions, kind of from a geological perspective?
Yeah, probably the answer to there is, there are a lot of other things to worry about before you worry about
Sure.
how climate change will affect the mantle. So I think it's mostly things associated with the fluid Earth, that is the atmosphere and oceans, because they're much smaller reservoirs, and B, they are able to change quickly, and to biology. So I think the mantle will be just fine. Rhinoceroses probably will not be just fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any progress that we've made? I mean, we have a lot of campaigns and initiatives, and people donate millions of dollars, and Hollywood stars get behind it. There's so much campaigns around this stuff. Is there any dent that's been made here in the past 15, 20 years for climate change?
Actually, yes, there has. And one has to say that, I understand that we have a collective responsibility to feed and house 8 billion people, and I take that seriously. So that has to be the context within which we approach questions of environmental change. But yeah, I mean, if you think of the kind of accords that various nations have signed over the last few years, at this point, I would say those tend to be slowing the rate at which things get worse, although there's some possibility that they will help things to get better. I think in terms of technology, I mean, the automobile you drive is much more efficient in terms of fuel and CO2 than what your parents drove. Airplanes use a fraction of the fuel they did before. We have the ability to heat and cool houses that is much more energy efficient. So there have been a lot of technological changes that move us in the right direction. One of the things that I think will come to pass is there are pilot plants now in several parts of the world that can actually strip CO2 from air. Now, in order to do those at scale, that's in the future. But there are technologies that will help us all. I think that despite the naysayers, there's a lot of good-minded people who are willing to do everything from, be mindful of the sources of their protein, because the amount of CO2 released for a pound of protein varies dramatically from one source to another. Buying locally saves the transport of things. So I think as individuals, there are things that can be done, and a lot of people are doing that work for the good. There are technologies, some of which are mature and some of which are just, beginning to be worked on, that on the scale of decades, I think could help us a great deal. I think governments are getting better at acknowledging that it's not only individuals that have a responsibility toward the planet, but there's things that only governments can do. So in a sense, as I say, I'm not, I fall short of being optimistic, but I know that some things that have happened in the last 20 years have been very, very helpful. In North American fisheries, there have been real changes just in management, and those have, brought a lot of fisheries back from the brink. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So yes, there are things that we can do and we are doing, and they're helpful, and we need to accelerate our activities just as the environmental change is accelerating.
Yeah, and I know that there's many trust foundations and big groups that have poured lots of money and research into trying to protect. A lot of conservation groups have tried to protect whaling and inappropriate killing of sharks and fisheries and all these things. There's a lot of big groups that have really done their part as well. The last question I have for you is how does understanding the geological history of the Earth, which you've written about so wonderfully, help us understand other planets? So we've mentioned Mars earlier in the conversation, but maybe other planets in our solar system or outside of that. And what is, understanding our history, tell us about maybe the future of life on Earth as well, looking forward.
Oh yeah, simple questions.
Yeah, it's a small one to end with.
Yeah. Well, so far, I think we have actually a fairly sophisticated understanding of the planets and moons in our solar system. And as you may know, there's a series of missions that are now underway or will be underway to look at Venus, our other close neighbor. And I think collectively, they help us understand why our planet is where it is, why it's made of what it's made of, and how that has helped Earth in its progress through time. That said, as we talked about earlier, Earth is truly unique among the planets we know. It certainly is the only planet where life has transformed the planet. It may or may not be the only place where life ever took root in our solar system. But so in some ways, the more we know about other planets, the more we may learn about Earth's origins and earliest history, but also the more we appreciate how Earth's history has diverged from that of other planets through time. So I think that helps us to understand the Earth. And remind me your other question, the future of life on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where are we a million years from now? 10 million, if, whether it's humans or just organisms, if you have your crystal ball, what would you predict if you could?
I think it was Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, who once said that prediction is difficult, especially about the future.
Yes.
And so, I find it hard to know what's going to be around 100 years from now. So I to be perfectly honest, I'm not trying to be snippy here or anything, but I think there's so much to worry about how the Earth will look on a time scale when I or my children are still alive. That 20 million years, who knows? If humans are here 20 million years from now, that will set a world record for the longevity of species. Will there be a terrestrial biosphere? Yeah, sure. One of the things we know from previous extinctions is that life does rebound.
Yeah.
But it's important to know that happens on million-year timescales, not on human timescales. So what we lose now in terms of any reasonable extrapolation of the human experience is permanent. So yes, in 20 million years, there will be forms of life that don't exist now. Who knows what they'll be? Yeah,
no, I totally agree with you on that. I think what's most important is right now in taking care of the planet we have now and how we've hurt it and how we've helped it maybe in some ways, but how to also, life is going to keep going. Life's going to continue on, even if there is mass extinctions, things like that. But if we don't, the planet will be fine in some ways. But we won't be here if we're going to just do ourselves in. So it really is just on us to take care of ourselves and collectively.
Yeah, I do think too that, I hope that as people understand the history of our planet and realize that all of the, land, sea, and organisms around us are the product of 4 billion years of history, that, wouldn't it be nice if that would move people to actually be a little more responsible toward the planet?
Hmm. Responsible, respectful, appreciative, humble, all of those things. I totally agree with you. Well, look, Andrew, I mean, this has been so much fun. I greatly, I could talk to you for, more and more hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. This has been great. The book is called A Brief History of Earth, 4 billion years in 8 chapters. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you and your work?
Well, the book is, as I always say, in all good bookstores and internet outlets and that. So it should be fairly easy to find. I sit in my little corner office at Harvard and just plug away.
Well, that's great. You're doing fantastic work, and we need people like you to keep doing all this great research. And so I can't say enough thanks for your time, your energy, your brilliance. This was such a fun conversation, and I hope to do it again soon.
Thanks a lot.
All right.